Now we're going to go into a panel discussion. And for this, I've got a treat for you all. Let's just get that on there. And here we go. And so it's an interesting panel discussion. We've managed to wangle some of the best minds out there when it comes to content strategy, information and content architecture, and they all come from varied backgrounds. This discussion is going to focus on how best to manage change and risk in technical documentation. And we have two ex-medical tech writers on board. That's myself and Bob. We should be able to talk about this in the context of regulated industries as well. I'll invite them to come on stage. So basically unveil yourselves as and when I present to you. First of all, we've got Val Swisher, founder and CEO at Content Rules. Val enjoys helping companies solve complex content problems. She's a well-known expert in content strategy, structured authoring, global content, content development, and terminology management. Val believes content should be easy to read, cost-effective to create and translate, and efficient to manage. Her fourth book, The Personalization Paradox, Why Companies Fail and How to Succeed at Creating Personalized Experiences at Scale, is out there on sale now. Look for it. It's in all the best bookshops. Welcome, Val. No worries.
Hi there. Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me today.
Next up, we've got David Turner. David Turner works with Content Conversion Laboratory, aka DCL. I'm going to say DCL from now on. He's a consultant in publishing automation, digital transformation, and content technologies. An industry veteran in areas around content management and content structure. Is particularly adept at demonstrating the business benefits of digital transformation and helping organizations identify ROI KPIs to gauge investments in systems, structure, and semantics. David is fluent across a number of industries and has helped scholarly publishers, global pharma organizations, and worldwide manufacturers recognize the value in the content structure and semantic enrichment. So, hi there,
hello,
David.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you very much for accepting to come and present with us, sir. Next up, we've got Kurt Kieser, Director of Client Solutions. Kurt, thanks. Hi. Kurt works in a complex and digital world. But the work he does helps simplify that complexity to help to make millions of people just that little bit happier every day. Today, he works as a client advocate at Tazoo, a company that perfectly aligns with his own interests and talents. His main focus with his clients is helping their end users get what they want and need within the context of the ever-changing, digitally driven, and always connected world. Welcome. Thanks a lot for accepting to
Thank you.
come and
Good
join
to be
us
here
today. And also from Tazoo, we've got Bob, I'll say from now on, Johnson. Bob is a senior content strategist, and he brings technical communication experience with content management as both a vendor and a customer, and experience with DITA to his role as a senior content strategist at Tazoo. Bob has worked in software, medical devices, and medical reference content, and has led DITA conversions and content migrations. He's also helped organizations mature their DITA implementation. Bob co-facilitates the Boston DITA Users Group and advocates for accessible technical communication. Welcome. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and seeing as I'm going to be moderating let's see, no, never mind. We're good. You can still see my screen actually. No, I should just. I don't have the stop sharing. I'll leave that on for now and we'll sort it out while we're chatting. So I'll introduce myself very quickly. There we go. Val's back. Basically, I work with companies now, but I've got a background as a technical writer, also in regulated industries and non-regulated. Started out in finance and then moved on to work with medical devices. And in October last year, as part of the big change that was going on, I decided to expand and go out there and push myself that little bit more, and join the vendor side of the of the counter, and basically advocate, as Bob does, for users. So basically, I'm bringing my experience to a vendor to help them make sure that we build the best possible product. So our topic today is how best to manage change and risk in technical documentation. We've got a series of questions that I thought would use to guide us through this. And so let's go for the first one. What do we mean when we talk about change management, and why is it important? Who would like to go first?
I can start. I think in terms of when we talk about change management, it really comes down to the fact that most people don't like to change very much. But in our businesses, we've got to change it. So we've got to have some sort of a process to get people to accept the changes in the process, to adapt to those changes in the process, and then hopefully to embrace the changes in the process, the changes in the technology, et cetera. And I think it's really crucial in the second half of the question because, when you look at all the reasons that projects fail, I read an article recently about 10 reasons why projects fail, and virtually all of them come back to poor change management, And I think it's because, when you think about that whole concept of turning the flywheel, to get things moving, small pushes over time, most times the flywheel's turning the other direction. And so that makes it even more difficult, to get it going. So it's critical so that we can get not just the system implemented, but that we can really get to the benefits of the new system or the new processes.
Thank you, David. Val?
I will add to that. As we always say, technology is easy, people are hard. So, right? So, companies are spending millions and millions of dollars on the shiny new object of whatever technology catches their eye at the moment. And when they leave the people behind, it doesn't matter how good your technology is. If you don't have buy-in from the people that have to use that technology, it's going to be an uphill battle constantly. It's just, just knock your head against the wall. So far too often, we don't plan for the people aspect, or we save it as an afterthought. Rather than realizing that we need to create a plan and the plan needs to be implemented before you turn on the go live switch. Yeah. So
cute.
That's my addition.
Kurt or Bob?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go next. I recently came across a quote from a former executive that I worked with, Shauna Hurd, who's VP for Transformation and Enterprise Data Management at Intuitive Surgical. And she says, change is a process. It's not a magic switch that we flip. And processes need to be planned, they need to be architected, and they need to be managed. So we need to prepare and equip individuals for organizational change. We have to support them through that change so they can adapt successfully to the new situation and drive organizational success. And the name we give to the management practice that supports this is change management.
That's very succinct. Thanks, Kurt.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we know that with at least our clients, about, in the past, projects that they've started, right, about 70% of them have failed. That's a number of factors contributed to that, but we do know that change management issues, we'll call it that, is definitely on the top of that list. It's one of the main reasons that the projects have failed in the past. So having a solid understanding of what it's going to take to, do all of the, not just the technical aspects of the project, but the people and the sort of expectations and consensus gathering and all of those things that need to happen is critically important for anytime you're shifting, your various technologies or the way that people are doing their jobs at their companies. So yeah, this is definitely a thing that we've identified and our strategic consulting group has been focused on since the inception.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, normally I've got a poll on here. As you see, I'm sort of like, trying to reach down. My mouse has decided to go on holiday. So I'm going to share the first poll question, and I'll give it a minute for everyone to answer. Have you had a successful experience with change management? Let's see what percentage of our audience has had a successful change management process.
I think we need some poll music.
Yeah, we could do Jeopardy.
Yeah, I did. I was actually looking into that, but it's hard getting music playing on Demio. I'd have to like upload it on there, and then we've got to consider like digital rights and things like that. So we knocked it on the head. Okay, so that's about a minute, and we've got the answers up there. So just under half have had a successful, change management experience, which is not much, is it? Considering like, I mean, it's something that seems so simple and like, that you should be able to implement. So it just proves that it is not as simple as that. And unless, as you mentioned, you have planned for it and like, it's that process. It's not just turn it on, turn it off. Unless you've planned for it and you go incrementally and like, make those changes over time, you're just not going to get anywhere, or you're not going to have it successfully. So next, let's move this on. The next question I've got is, so in what way does a CCMS or structured content impact change management? What impacts?
Well, I think it's something that really impacts everything. I mean, when you start putting structured content in, it's a complete mind shift, right? Now, in different organizations, some may never actually touch content, but when content is important, it's a really big thing because you're changing from this document idea to this component idea. And so it's going to affect how you author content. It's going to affect how you review content. In many cases, it turns something that was informal into something that's formal. It requires governance. It takes rules. It takes maintenance. And probably the biggest, most difficult thing of all, it requires people to get on the same page. I think all of us on this call have probably dealt with that client who said, oh, yeah, we're going to install that CCMS. We're going to make a decision June 30th. We figure we'll have it up, I don't know, July 15th. And everybody will be on the new system, and be all working forward. And we're like, and it's not because you can't implement the tool. It's not because you can't turn on the licenses. You can't get everybody in an organization on the same page in an organization of 5 people, much less 50 or 500, 5,000 or 50,000. I mean, it's just it's just difficult.
So were you watching me like about 5-6 years ago when we made our move into DITA and like, it was like, yes, all of this should be done in 1 quarter. And like, next quarter, we're going to have all the manuals like in there. And I looked at, the other project managers, and from our calculations, we'd done like, we said, it'll take us about 2 to 3 years. Right? No. Next quarter, we want it out there. And what happened? Yeah. Well, 3 years later, we had about 80-90% of it out there ready to go. Unused.
And I've had people tell me, you tell them it takes this long, and they say, oh, well, then we're looking at the wrong tool. It's the wrong tool then. We must be able to find a tool that will allow us to do this in the speed that we want to do it. And it's not, it's the people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I,
for sure.
I want to follow up on
Yeah,
that because a change to a structured content strategy is really a cultural change. It's not a technical change. And you're fundamentally asking all of your stakeholders to change how they interact with content on that more granular level. And with less control over the published output. And for technical communicators, they're very often on board. They think that's great. Not always. But stakeholders that are used to, and I've seen this, doing reviews in kind of a lazy way where they say, yeah, I don't like this page break. Fix this page break. I want the page to break somewhere else. Or, something equally trivial. And in a structured content environment, you don't have that option. And your stakeholders, oh my heavens, actually have to read the content. Can you believe it? They actually have to engage with it. Not glance over it and make this trivial change and then I'll approve it, So you have to get them used to the idea that they got to hand over the keys, right? And that again is not a technical change.
Yes,
it's a cultural change, and it's a fundamental cultural change.
I would also.
I was just going to say, one of the key challenges there from a change management perspective is really understanding all of those types of interests and roles and maybe like the political structure and organization of the company, right? It might be that there's a very strong top-down mandate for this to happen, or it's a bottoms-up or a cross-organizational sort of consensus building requirement first, right? So you can't just walk in and assume that everybody's going to be moving in the same direction of some dictated model, or you have to sort of work that out with the client and with your stakeholders, with your champions that you're working with. So just as an example, right, we have a client with 380 something authors, but they're across five different global sort of companies,
at least.
Yeah, and very independent, right? All very independent and not used to sort of conforming or change, right? And so it becomes this process of figuring out, okay, what is critically important? What must have to happen? What can we do with the people we have? Where can we make changes? How do we incentivize? And then how do we, handle the dissidents, the ones that refuse for whatever reason? And what kind of changes have to happen there? So it becomes it's definitely a process, more like instead of a big bang, it's more like an appropriately sized bang that needs to happen at these places.
When you move to structure, you're also asking people to work together.
Yes.
And you're asking them to write in a very different way. It's really a fundamental shift in how you conceptualize your content, where we have not been taught to think in components. We have not been taught to write in a way that's reusable. We have not been taught, we're often implored to follow a style guide, but if we don't, nobody seems to catch us. And once we move to an environment where our content is being shared, if you have 300 writers, you could have 20 people all writing different components for the same final output. Nobody taught us how to do this. Nobody taught us what a component is. Even, unfortunately, most of the people coming out of tech talk programs today still aren't being taught
Yes.
how to write for a structured content environment. And what I see over and over again in my customer base is if they're not taught, you end up having a 35-page component. That's it. I made my chapter into one topic, because nobody really taught me. It works. I can publish it. Yeah, I put it with other chapters. I got a book. I'm good. So, nobody has taught everyone. So there's convincing everyone that they now want to do this, which is, unto itself. And then there's actually giving them the tools they need to be successful because they don't have a choice.
35-page topic.
So that's another part of it.
And I have seen examples like that. Let's move on. Next question. So what's your experience of how companies tend to do this? And you all work with various companies. I'm like the sort of newbie in trying to work with loads of people. So what's your experience in how companies tend to do this change management and where they
can I give the consultant answer? It depends.
Yeah.
Right.
It depends. You're not allowed to say it depends.
But it really does, right? So it depends on
a
lot of times who's running the project. If this project is really led by like an internal champion, change management might be handled one way. If there's a group of champions, it might be led a little bit differently. If it's led by the technology provider, if Companize is kind of leading the charge, you might manage it differently. If a consultant like Val is leading it, might be different. If a systems integrator is leading it, again, it might be different.
What's the percentage split across those different types of?
I don't know that I could even name
that you've encountered. No, anyone?
Yeah. And that, because that depends on industry. It depends on
pretty good blend.
People in the. Like we just did a project recently, and this company has implemented a couple of times before a system, and so they've been doing this for 15 years, right? They're in a very different place in terms of they can lead this thing themselves from somebody who comes and is trying it for the first time, and those people sometimes really depend on a consultant, and sometimes others really depend on their technology provider.
In my experience, the majority of companies do it too late. The majority of companies wait until far too long in the process to think about it. And there's usually shock and disbelief that everybody from management, that everybody didn't just want to jump on the bandwagon and change the way that they do their jobs. Every now and then I've come across a company, like David was saying, that's actually done it before. So they kind of bring their war wounds with them. But far too often, the magnitude of the shift is underestimated. And I hate it when a customer has to fail before they succeed. It's painful. It's painful to come in afterwards and try to pick up the pieces and get everybody moving again. It's much easier when you plan for it. If you know you're changing systems, know that you're asking people to change the way they do their jobs from the beginning, and then start building your plan long before people need to.
But people are trying to sell this thing to their management, right? They're trying to sell this thing to the other people in their company, and so they minimize the cost for change management. They minimize the process because they think, and probably those who are sitting listening to us say, you guys are a bunch of consultants. You don't know what it's like here in the real world, right? In the real world, we got to convince somebody to give us the budget for these licenses. I can barely get that, much less to plan also for, change management processes. So, you understand it, but, if you don't do it, then you end up having a system that's like, it's like you got an airplane that's designed to take you around the world, but the only thing your company uses it for is to, taxi around the tarmac, right? It's just
I love that. I love that. I'm going to be quoting quite a
That's a
lot of
new
you
one.
guys, you know. And you've actually really segued into the next two questions. You know, you've already started answering them. And like, you know, one is, how should companies handle, like, you know, change management in this context? And the next one, what are the invisible challenges that they should be aware of? So you've already started on that, and like, you know, so let's get off that, you know, the runway, and like, you know, let's get them up in the air.
Yeah. I'll start that last one or that first question, because you hit the nail on the head with the problem that one of our recent clients is facing, right? They have an internal, and most companies do, change management, business unit that is supposed to work cross-functionally with all of these different groups to help make sure that they have successful projects and so forth. And they honestly are a great resource because they do understand the ins and outs of all of the political factions and all the issues inside the company. What they don't understand are the uniqueness or the unique challenges of doing something like switching from a monolithic to a component-based authoring paradigm, right? So what we found is that in order for them to be successful, we have to partner with them. It really does become our change management experts in this particular field working with their change management experts that are working in their company, right? So it really needs to be a hand-in-hand fit for it to be successful.
I think,
Agreed.
and confession time here, because I managed a structured content conversion and CCMS implementation that focused on the technical aspects, thinking I had the executive backing, which I did, but didn't build the change management to bring all the stakeholders along. And so we converted content, we implemented the CCMS, we got all this, and a new opportunity came. I moved on.
Yeah.
And they trashed it. And because the stakeholders were not accommodating, they were not adjusting. I had not done the change management part of the project because I'm a tool and technologies guy, so I was focused on the tools and technologies, and I didn't focus enough on change management and especially culture. And that's where I learned how critical culture is. And your question about the invisible challenge. People problems are a big problem. And the fundamental problem is culture, what people are accustomed to, and recognizing that change to structured authoring, component content management is not just a technical change. It is a technical change, but it's also a culture change. It's how you think about content, how you approach it, how you engage it, both as an author and as a reviewer. And it's more challenging for the reviewer because they're used to engaging these monolithic documents and not understanding, I don't like this sentence here, change it. Well, that's part of a component that I'm using in a dozen different places. I can't change that. And that's not something that, we talk about, technical communicators not being taught about this. Stakeholders are far from educated about this. And that is critical to the success. If you don't do it, you can expect your initiative to fail. Hard-won experience.
And I'll actually add to that experience in that, in that culture, one from the author side, in that you no longer own content. If you want to own content, go and write a book, But when it comes to like technical communication and you move into structured content, that Yeah, well, you've written a book, yeah. So you still like to own your
Yeah.
content, Val. But yeah, that thing where where you say this is my service manual, it is no longer your service manual. You are contributing to one huge bit of it. And then from the SME side of it, and you touched on that point in that, this warning message, I don't like it, so can we just change it? I'm like, well, no, because we're using exactly the same thing in 3 other products and 6 other chapters, and you change it here. Well, where's your change management to affect all of those? Because, I could change it, but then when we get audited and they say, well, why did you change it for this chapter? And you've got no reason for it. Yeah. Boom. You're in trouble.
Yeah, and when you talk about content ownership, we're dealing with the challenge with one of our clients that the authors, they're very senior people, and they are used to having a lot of ownership over content, and it's very challenging to say to them, people, this is work for hire. You don't own this content. The organization owns it. That working with medical reference content, when you're engaging, especially with doctors, right, who, we tell them they're the smartest people in the room, right? So when they don't want to give up ownership of that content, it's very challenging. Yeah. Especially when you're dealing with them in more of a contractor volunteer capacity than as an employee capacity. But you're dealing with people that have a strong sense of ownership and have the political leverage to, fight you and butt heads on how much.
If I was going to give somebody advice on the way to handle these change management projects, I would think about, think about like what Bob said about, when he left. I used to work in a CCMS provider, and I was sent out to find out, hey, why have these companies that used to be customers stopped paying their maintenance fees? And in every one of them, what had happened was the champion had left the organization, right? And eventually the whole thing fell apart. So I tell people, go in and don't develop a champion. You need to develop a team of champions. And you need to be constantly making sure that they're still champions as much as possible. And then I think on the flip side of that, I think it's Amber Swope who says this. She has a whole thing about love your curmudgeon. And, so identify who your most difficult person is on the team and work on turning that person into a believer and listening to that person, because that person's going to help you uncover hidden resentments. It's going to help you uncover hidden workarounds. And once you can turn that person, it'll motivate other people to buy in.
Definitely. Time for another poll. Let's share this one now. And of the changes you're trying to implement, which is the most important to you? So this is I'm going to give you a minute, but I'll keep talking while you're answering. So this is what we've just been talking about. Is it your content reuse strategy? Is it selecting that CCMS? Is it deciding on what to migrate to the new system? And depending on your answer, that's going to show you how much of a balance you've put on that convincing of the others, to use it. Are you concentrating just on strategy? Are you your tools person, like Bob just mentioned, he concentrated on the tools, let's see what the answers are. Keep them coming. Yeah, we got the music. No trademarks. Okay, we got fewer answers in this one. I'm not going to close it. I'll leave it open still, but we got fewer answers here. And, a big 89% of the audience are looking at content reuse strategy. Comments, panel?
I think it depends upon what phase you're in terms of your transition, because once you've figured out your reuse strategy and once you've selected your CCMS, figuring out which content to migrate with you becomes a really big problem. But if you're still in the throes of, how are we going to do this and what tools are we going to use, you're not thinking about, oh my gosh, we have 7 million pages of Word documents. What are we going to do with them? So I really think that it depends upon where you are in your, in
Okay,
your
so
journey.
moving on then.
towards
So
structure.
what sort of actionable steps can be presented to management or to to executives to help them? We've sort of touched on those, but can we maybe come out with a list for people?
I think one of the keys is not just to have that executive champion. I mean, having an executive champion is great, but you need that executive champion to be actively engaged. So if you're having meetings, you should really have that executive champion participating, because it's easy if that executive champion isn't there for the resisting individuals to push back, to make it more difficult. If that executive champion is there, they can offset that or prevent it from happening in the first place. So and again, this is hard-won experience. I really wish I had brought my champion in to actively engage in meetings rather than just saying, well, the executive VP is behind this. Well, they're going to find, someone else that's not, unless that executive VP is in the meeting to offset that and, hold that leverage.
I'd say as far as actionable steps, you got to make change management a non-negotiable
Certainly.
at the start of the project. And again, that's hard because you're trying to get budget for licenses and you're trying to get you're trying to get budget for professional services and all those things. But, honestly, you wouldn't move into a new house where the plumbing doesn't work, right? That's a non-negotiable. You wouldn't implement a CCMS with 5 user licenses if you have a team of 500, right? That's unthinkable. It's a non-negotiable. So like in the same way, you've got to present it to management as, the spending that we're going to do here, it's critical. It's absolutely essential. That's part one. And then just the other part that I would say that people don't think about in this is, don't forget the content piece when you're planning for these kinds of things. We tend to always think people, process, technology. But, in this business, we've also got content. And if you don't get the content right, you can have planned a really fantastic system and gotten people in there with all sorts of great user interface and whatever. They go in there to find that first document to reuse. They can't find it. They go, this doesn't work. What a stupid system.
Yep.
Or if you ask them to spend the next 3 months cleaning up content, or 6 months or a year, where they can't actually get to the benefits of the system, they're going to hate it. So when you're presenting to management, build in, let's get the content right.
Okay.
When it comes to specifically to content reuse strategy, one of the things that we did when I was at VMware, when we were doing this whole transition to DITA, we put it on the individual writing managers to really identify in their teams who was very comfortable, kind of like ranked, who was very comfortable with writing about a particular topic, somewhat comfortable, very uncomfortable, kind of like scale, right? Because what you'll find in a monolithic system is that even a writer who loves their document, love portions of that document they don't really feel comfortable with, that they always have to go to somebody else for. And you start identifying these areas of content reusability across documents, right? Where you may have someone who's very expert at doing, this one particular common use case across these different documents. And you start identifying, your roles are changing, but you still own something. You're just in a more collaborative environment, right? And so that was one of the things that I would highly recommend to anyone looking at trying to figure out this sort of change management plus all of these other things at the same time, and start trying to identify, this is an opportunity for people. It's not just a hard thing. It's also an opportunity for them to grow in their careers and become,
Sorry, that's our 5-minute warning.
Right?
So we've got a couple of questions there. We're doing really well for time, actually. I'm surprised. I thought we'd have to drop off a couple of questions. But this one, though, is going to be, that it's going to want, incite us to talk. But how do you remain compliant? That system where we had the one monolithic document that you used to just dump into something and then send off to something and get approved all as one big chunk is now split across thousands of little topics. How do you remain compliant in a world with structured content where you've got pieces all over the place shared across different manuals or different products?
This is Bob's wheelhouse.
It's a challenge, right? Because especially, for example, in medical devices, you don't approve components. You approve complete units, right? You approve a complete IFU.
IFU instructions for use.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. When I first went in, naive Bob, we're going to get the requirement ID and we're going to tie it to the DITA topic ID. And I'm going to publish a report that says where each requirement is fulfilled. And there you go. And that's what we're going to give, and they're going to approve it. In medical devices, at least, that's not how it works. You have to approve the content in context. So you ultimately, however much you're managing on a component level, the final approval is on the deliverable. And all those components are managed, go through the process, but they are not what gets approved. It's the deliverables that get approved. And that makes it challenging in a component environment, because you also get the pushback that I want this little change here, I want this little change there. And getting the stakeholders to understand, we're reusing this. We've approved this content as is already. We should reuse it as approved. And that can be really, really challenging. I've seen that come from the very top levels, literally, that, but I want this change. Well, this text
the only way I managed to get some part of that concept approved, using the keyword there, approved, was the part where we divided safety notifications into one topic. And so, as such, a safety warning, do not put your fork into the socket, is a unit as it's on its own, and as a component that can be approved and can then be shared, and you can then say to regulatory affairs that this has been approved, so I can use it. You don't have to reapprove it. As such, what we did was then just sort of separate things out, so we could very quickly do an approval of all the safety notifications. And because safety is the longest part when it comes to reviewing some of this content, especially on the user side, you were able to shorten that time that it took to approve. However, the rest of the components, you want to see it in context, you want to see it in
the warnings and cautions are what your regulatory authorities really pay attention to more than anything else. And that's where you're really going to have problems if you're not careful. They pay very tight attention to them. On the other hand, if you've got something that you've put through the process, you've already approved, then should be able to reuse it and get it approved in other contexts and get through regulatory that much more quickly while reducing your authoring costs.
We're out of time, but I'll let you just have a last word, and I'll
are
put
we
up
out of
the
time?
poll at the same time, so like people can multitask. Go on.
There we go. Yeah, so I was going to say, in pharma, it's a little bit different than med device. In pharma, we usually separate out the components, which are the input, from the actual documents that are going to regulatory using a RIM system, a regulatory information management system. So the approvals are at the document level, while the storage of the input is at the component level. I think it makes it a little bit easier to track. Of course, then you have this whole other system you have to deal with, so it's never really easier. But that's one way that we've looked at it in a pharma standpoint. And then the RIM system forevermore stores those approved documents so that we have them, they're marked in time, everything around them that they need. And then, of course, we know if something is approved and reused someplace else, well, we know it's approved because it's in a different document in the RIM system. If you need to change it, well, then you need a derivative. So I think, but medical device is a little bit different than.
Okay, so it sounds like we're going to have to take this particular topic. How do you remain compliant? And we're going to create content. We're going to let's work together. Let's maybe do another webinar or get together, write something to on just this particular compliance issue. The last question that was on there that we didn't really get to answer, but it sort of was inferred in between, and Bob referred to it, is what happens when your champion leaves? That DITA expert who leaves the company, what should you do to make sure your systems are not person dependent? And Bob, mentioned it, in that don't have one champion. You should have multitude of champions so that, it doesn't feel nice saying to somebody you're replaceable, but yeah, you should really have replaceable competence as part of your content component management system. So
the nice way to say it is you might win the lottery. More realistic way to say it is you might get hit by
I think the odds are sort of shorter on that.
I think the odds for the second are higher than for the first, but I mean, it's a reality.
Okay, so the last poll that's up there, I'll just quickly read it out. I've got a couple of answers in there, but where are you in your structured content journey? Are you thinking about it? Are you building your business case or requesting funding? Are you identifying a consultant for support or, your service providers? Are you evaluating tools, or are you actually in the process of implementing? Let us know in there, it shouldn't take you that long. While you're voting up there, I'm going to thank the panel. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It's really interesting. I think next time we'll have to set aside an hour, and just make it just this. Like I said, because we could go on, there's so much interesting stuff. And you mentioned one thing and you get 5 topics that come off of that, so again, thank you very much. Val, we'll be seeing you later. You've got an expert presentation later on. If you guys want to stick around, Bob, Kurt, David, feel free to. Like I said, we'll open the mic up at the end of the entire summit, so maybe people have questions on there. Talking about questions, there is one question that Sakura has asked. And it's, I hear today that technical writing / technical communication schools don't teach how to write componentized content. Then what other helpful resources can people easily access for this?
I'd start by visiting contentrules.com. Val has...
There you go.
I
You
have learned a
go.
ton from
You
from
go,
Val's
David.
blogs. I've
Yeah,
learned a
I
ton
pay him really well to say that. You go.
from
Yes.
Val's books. Also, there are a couple other consultants. I mean, Dawn, I think, is speaking later, and they have some courses that they do that are outstanding.
Yes.
Um,
I've followed a few Comtech courses, and they're excellent. Advanced reuse strategies and things like that. They're brilliant. So yep, definitely. I agree with going on to content rules as well. There's loads of there's loads of resources that are coming online. I'd say that actually in my I teach at University of Paris, and there DCL learning series as well. Sorry, didn't mention DCL learning series, which are quite good. You got video and article content on there, but also universities here in the University of Paris here does have structured writing now included. Now, when I studied, this was when I did my master's, it was about 2005, around about. I did have a structured writing course. I did have a DITA course, but it wasn't as fully fledged. It did not prepare me as much as what is going on today. But as we're building on, we're finding the universities and what I was going to say was University of Paris does have content in there. One thing that we're working on with Jean-Luc as well is maybe we're going to propose to the university is maybe even actually giving them access to a content management system, which is what is missing. They get to learn X-Metal or oxygen and all that sort of stuff, but there's no real environment of being in a content management system. So it's something that we'll be working on, and come and attend the University of Paris. Okay, so we've run out of time. We're well over time. Thank you again to everyone. And we'll be speaking with you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Yes, thanks for inviting
Thank
me.
you.
Okay.
This was fun.
Thank you so much.
And
I know.
let's moving on to the next.